we're going to run through, we just got back from family reunion, tons of really, really cool stuff. One of my favorite parts, and I will be the first to acknowledge I'm a little bit of a dork, a little bit of a nerd, whatever term you want to use. One of my favorite parts is what we call the vision speech. But really what it is it's looking at everything that has happened in real estate and in our economy and connecting all the dots as far as how things, where we are, where we've been, and how things are trending. I am a firm believer that it is our responsibility to be more educated about real estate and the pieces of the economy that directly affect real estate than our consumers are. So I think it behooves us to be very, very informed as far as how real estate is trending, what it means for the industry, what it means for our consumers. So we are going to rip through a ton of information. So I'm going to go super, super fast. I'm going to try to leave some space at the end if we can for a little bit of discussion, but I'm going to cover a lot of stuff. Some of the slides I'm going to move pretty quickly through if I don't think there's a whole lot to discuss or they're pretty self-explanatory. There might be a few that I might point out some trends. One of the things I love is two things. One, and I've heard it before, but I heard this quote while we were at family reunion also. And it is, the comment was, part of leadership is to know what it is, know what it could be, and make it happen, right? And the know what it is, there's a ... to that, and know that it's not worse than it actually is, right? The reality is we all love to create stories. Like it's just a human thing, right? That's why we catch a fish this big, but every time we tell the story, right, the fish gets a little bit bigger, a little bit bigger. Next thing you know, instead of a pumpkin seed, we call it like a whale or some nonsense, right? Like we just love to tell stories. A lot of times things aren't as big, as bad, as good as we sometimes make them out to be. I did one of these probably close to a year ago where we kind of did some myth busting. You know, here's some of the things that people are saying out in the real estate world. Let's pull some data and see how much of it is true, right? So we're going to run through a lot of data here. Okay, number one, disclaimer. This is all data checked, blah, yada, yada, yada. We're not responsible for anything. If there is a misquote of this or that or whatever, you don't get to sue me. You don't get to sue Keller Williams yet. Lots of accurate data here. Here's some of the things we're going to hit on. The numbers that drive the U.S. real estate economy. We're going to talk about home sales, home prices, total market volume, inventory, mortgage rates, affordability. Okay, we're going to hit on a bunch of stuff here. You guys have seen me share slides like this in the past. Those of you who have seen the vision statement, this is home sales annually, all the way back to 1990. If you see that dotted purple line across there, that is 2023. Right, you can see the purple bar graph, the second to the last bar here, 4.1. That was our total closed units, was 4.1 million in 2024. They are predicting 4.2 million for 2025, which means 2025 is projected to look a lot like 2024. Okay, what I find interesting, put your hand up if you were in real estate during the Great Recession, i.e. the banking crash. All right, we got a couple hands up there. Do you notice, if you follow that purple line across, right, last 2 years plus next year, 4.1, 4.1, 4.2, you go back to the Great Recession, that was 08, where you see that 4.1, 4.3, 4.2, 4.3. We're doing about the same number of units as we were doing during the Great Recession. Okay, now there's going to be a caveat to that in later slides, but when it comes to the number of transactions that are taking place, we are sitting exactly where we were sitting during the Great Recession. Okay, and that lasted at that pace for about 4 years. Okay. Now, home sales by month. The only thing that popped out at me that's interesting here is if you look across, your purple is 2023, your green is 2024. And if you look, most of the months, we did a little bit more in 2023 than we did in 2024. However, that trend starts to change when you hit October. So October, November, December of last year, we actually sold a little bit more real estate 3 months in a row than we did the prior year. All right. What I always say is when you see a change in statistics, when you see it for a month, that is an event, right? When you see it 2 months in a row, that is a pattern. When you see it 3 months in a row, it tends to be a trend, right? 3 months of moving in a similar direction tends to be a trend. Doesn't always pan out to be true, but typically 1 month is an event, 2 is a pattern, 3 is a trend. We have 3 months, last quarter of last year, we sold more real estate every month than we did that month the year prior. So that does show an upward trend as far as the total amount of homes that are being sold in the United States. Home prices. This is really interesting. So I did this about a year ago in my own state, Connecticut, where I took the average appreciation of 4%. I went all the way back at the time, I think to 2008, and I applied compounding 4% interest year over year over year, which we did not get in Connecticut. I wanted to see if you just got 4% appreciation every year since the Great Recession, what would the median sales price be? When I ran that exercise about a year ago, it was actually about a year, a little more than a year ago. It was probably 15 months ago. I landed exactly at the current median sales price in Connecticut, right? What that meant was our housing cost in Connecticut, our median sales price is exactly what it should be historically. The difference was we went a whole bunch of time without getting any appreciation, and then we all of a sudden got all of it in 3 years. So it felt like a bubble, when the reality is all it did is get us back to where we were supposed to be. Those are really important things to know, because I know for me here in Connecticut, non-real estate people ask me all the time about the bubble. And my response has always been, this is not a bubble. Our median sales price is exactly where it's supposed to be. It just feels weird because we got all of our appreciation in 3 years, right? Now, if you look nationally, we are actually above the curve, right? So we talked about, see this time frame from 2008 all the way to 2022. Nationally, we were below. We were below that 4% appreciation annually, right? And then all of a sudden, we know it was driven by the pandemic. Come 2020, we saw a surge into 2021, all the way to today. We've seen prices increase. Nationally, we are 9.9% over what housing pricing would be if we just had 4% annual, right? So that's on a national basis. Everything that we talk about nationally, I would encourage you to go find out, what does that look like in your market? So if you're in Massachusetts, or you want to drill down even deeper, you're in Eastern Mass compared to Western Mass, but you should know this stuff, right? You should be able to have these conversations, because a lot of this, you've got buyers who are sitting on the fence because they think things are overpriced and they're going to wait for things to cool down, right? What you and I know is if we're only 9% over what median sales price would be with normal historical appreciation, and oh, by the way, still have a massive inventory issue, chances are prices are going up, not down. Sitting on the sideline becomes very expensive, right? So we need to understand those things. This is just another visual that shows you that line that we looked at on the previous slide was a very steady line up. This is what it actually looked like though, right? So you can see here each year what we actually got for appreciation. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. Again, you get to the Great Recession, you can see rather than appreciating, real estate values were depreciating, right? We had a 9.5% decrease in home values nationally in 08, followed by 12.9. That's a massive, massive dip, right? And you also see the peak right here. You can see we were trending right along that 4% from 1990 all the way to 2000. Then we started getting 6, 7, 8, 9, 12. And then there was the cliff, and that was the banking crash. And then we lost 13% home value in a single year, right? Then you come back over to here, 2012 to 2019, nationally, we got back on track, right? We were hovering a little bit above that 4% average. That is different state to state, though. Again, being in Connecticut, I can tell you Connecticut was not getting that appreciation over that time frame. But nationally, for that stretch from 2012 to 2019, appreciation returned to normal. And then the pandemic hit, and we see this 9% nationally. 2021, we had 18%, 10%. Now you see it coming back down. We had 0.9%. And then we're seeing it come back to about average, right? So we're starting to see that adjust. Here's the thing you guys have heard me say over and over and over and over and over again. If you're on this call and you're from New England, we're kind of blessed. Everything happens somewhere else first. If you're paying attention, you know what's coming, right? The thing you always hear me say is New England tends to be late to the party and we don't party as hard, meaning everything starts happening somewhere else first. And when it shows up here, it shows up to a lesser degree. We don't boom as big and we don't crash as hard, right? We are already seeing, and I've mentioned it on other calls, Florida, Arizona, Texas, California. Those are all what I call windshield states, meaning everything happens there first. If you're paying attention, you can figure out what's coming our way, right? We're going to see some version of that, probably just slightly smaller. Inventories in all of those places I just mentioned are through the roof. Many of those areas are actually buyer markets right now, right? And we're seeing appreciation settling in, or in some cases, values even coming down in some areas. Now, in New England, we have a little bit of a unique situation in that we have less new construction than every one of those states that I just mentioned, right? And we know the two things we need in order to increase inventory, which more inventory is what's going to slow appreciation. We need rates to come down, or we need new construction of single family homes. We have very little new construction in comparison to other states. Rates are predicted to stay pretty close to what they are now throughout 2025, and we're going to talk about that in some future slides. Again, home prices, this is just another that shows you the historical, where what appreciation actually was. It's the exact same stats, just a different visual that shows you that full history all the way back to 1954. What I do love about this is when we think about investing in real estate, I feel like this is a really good visual for you to understand that holding real estate is always a good idea. Right? A lot of times we want to get out of real estate when the market's bad, right? It's no different than a stock market. You lose money when you sell down. But history tells us as long as we hold on, we continue to gain value over time, but it is not linear. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, right? So the key is when you hold it over time, history says we always get appreciation, okay? Total market volume, this is where the story changes. So when we were looking at units, we were saying, okay, we're doing the same amount of units nationally as we were during the Great Recession. But here's a really big difference. Great Recession was 2008. So this is now market volume in trillions. So we did $1 trillion in real estate volume in 2008. Doing the same amount of units, we did 2.19 trillion, double the volume. Same amount of units, double the volume, right? Reason is homes cost twice as much, almost exactly today as they did back in 2008, right? So from a volume standpoint, it's a very, very different picture. If you look at the total volume sold, even though units were down to where the Great Recession was, I believe if you count across, that would make 2024 the 5th best year in real estate since 1999, right? You've got, let's see, third best. Third best in volume since 1999. Do we get paid on units or volume?
Volume.
Volume, yeah, of course, right? We get paid on volume, right? I would also argue when we get to future slides, during the banking crash, we saw a restriction of agent population, right? I think we lost somewhere around 350,000 agents during the Great Recession. We have not seen that yet. We have not seen a massive a massive reduction in NAR membership, i.e. agent population. My belief is part of that is, even though the units are so low, the volume is compensating, right? You can make a living selling less homes. And by the way, this is rough math. The median household income over that time frame from 2008 to today increased by about 65%, right? But if you look at the volume from 2008 to today, it's more than double. So if you look at what it costs to live in this country and the amount of commission that comes out of that level of volume, the reality is commission has doubled over the same time frame where cost of living is up 65%, right? So that means our money, the amount of money we earn selling the same amount of houses today compared to 2008, goes 35% further than what it did in 2008. So essentially, because of the increase in values, despite the low units, the industry has gotten a raise. This is your inventory annually. You can see what our problem is. So this is inventory by months. How many months of inventory do we have nationally? And you can see right now, nationally, 2024, we were sitting at 3.7 months. Typically, they will say 6 months is a balanced market. 4 months, right? 6 months is balanced. Anything above that, it's shifting to a buyer's market. Yet, if you look historically, we haven't really seen, you have to go back to 1995, 1997, right? We were in that 6-month inventory. Then we had the dip all the way through 2025. We had a big surge, right? That was the Great Recession. There were more homes on, more listings than there was demand for those listings. That's when we saw inventory spike. And then we started to see that coming back down in 2011. And we had a pretty steady downward trend all the way through to the pandemic, where we hit a low of 2.3 nationally. We know some of us in certain areas where we operate, we have inventory less than a month in some towns, some zip codes, right? But nationally, we're sitting at 3.7 at the end of 2024. Mortgage rates. This one is really important, I believe. Obviously, the mortgage rate has a massive impact on our buyers' buying power, right? And most of our sellers are buyers, so this impacts the market across the board. If you look at your dark green dotted line, that is your historical average from 1990 to today, 6%. If you go all the way back to 1972, the historical average for a mortgage interest rate is 7.72. Today, right, we're sitting at about 6.5. That's where we ended the year in high sixes. And they're predicting this year that we're probably going to spend most of the year in that 6.5 range. It is my belief, and this is just my opinion, I believe until we see that rate go down to about 5.5, I think we're going to continue to have homeowners making rate decisions rather than life decisions. Meaning they're not going to let go of those sub 3%, sub 4% mortgages until we get to somewhere in that 5.5 range. I think when we get there, that's when people will start making life decisions instead of rate decisions with respect to making a decision to actually move. What's important though is we are like goldfish. We have very small memories. And by the way, I don't know if that's true, so I apologize to all the goldfish out there if they actually have wonderful memories. I have absolutely no idea how they figured out goldfish have short memories. But the story is they have short memories, and so do we. So the big challenge we have is, even though 7.72 is the historical average, 6% is the historical average since 1990. What do our consumers remember? Yeah. Dan's doing this, and that's not West Side. That's 3%, right? They're 3% interest rates, 4%, right? Some of them are sub 3%. So that's big sticker shock when that adjusts. But the reality is we are within range of what historical averages are. However, when you look at this big dip from 2008 all the way until 2023, this is what we remember. right? And that is what's causing the sticker shock. It is all that time that we spent below the historical average that became the new norm is what's causing people to hold tight to their current rates and their current homes. Again, my belief is it's about 5.5 is when we'll start to see some of that inventory unleash. Currently, they are not predicting that that will happen in 2025. They believe the rates are going to be around 6.5 for most of 2025. Again, this is just another visualization of the same, and you can see that low point in December of 2020. Rates went as low as 2.68. Chances are nobody on this call will ever see that again in our lifetime. It's not impossible. It could happen, but it is highly unlikely. And history would say that we will probably never see sub 3% mortgages ever again. Again, doesn't mean it can't happen, but it is highly unlikely that we will ever see that again in our lifetime. Yet consumers have to get used to what is the real norm instead of the perceived norm. If it happens again, this world it's cut off. But I could probably finish the sentence. Well, here's the reality. It wasn't good for us. And I think everybody on this call knows that. At the end of the day, they froze the market by allowing rates to go that low, right? That was not good for us long term. That was like eating cookies, right? It was very enjoyable in the moment, but long term was really, really bad for us, right? Like rates that low is like pizza, it's cookies, it's potato chips. It's a great experience in the moment, long term, terrible idea. So mortgage rates, this is interesting. 74% of mortgages are below 5% right now, or 5% or less. This shows you that breakdown. 22% are 3% or less. 3 to 4% makes up 34% of the mortgages out there. 4 to 5 is 18, 5 to 6 is 10, and just 6% of mortgages, or I'm sorry, just 16% of mortgages currently are above 6%. So that gives you an idea of how many people are sitting on smaller mortgages. And by the way, also gives you an idea, right? When we talk about sort of those dominoes of how low does the rate need to go for people to start making life decisions instead of rate decisions. Well, if you're sitting at 4.5, or 5 to 6, you're in a position to make life decisions, not rate decisions. The people we have to worry about is this 56% over here that are somewhere in between less than 3 up to 4%. Those are the people that I think rates need to get to the 5.5 in order to get those folks to start thinking about making moves. Colleen, what do you got?
So Matt, the people that are sitting at that low rate, though, a lot of them have a ton of equity. And so it used to be if you buy down a rate, 1% was like, it was like 1% of whatever the purchase price was. But it feels like, or last time someone did that, it's much more expensive. However, people do have the equity to buy down a rate that's more comfortable for them.
So this is why knowing all this stuff is important, right? Regular consumers, there's certainly some savvy consumers out there that know and understand what Colleen just said, but the vast majority do not. Those are the conversations we need to be having with people to help them understand what their options actually are. Because you are correct, we have more equity today than we have ever had in our homes in the history of our country, right? So yes, when they sell, they can actually afford to buy that rate down, right? But these are things that we have to educate them on, educating them on the fact that there are options, right? For a lot of our buyers right now, it might be a good idea to get an ARM because it is likely that over a 2-year, 5-year period, rates likely will come down. We don't know that for certain, but history would say it is likely, right? So all of a sudden getting into a 5/1 ARM or some other structure like that makes sense. Buying the loan down with a point might make sense. Those are all the things, if we know and understand all this, we can have much better conversations with our clients. Affordability. So this shows what percent of our household income does it take to own a home at the median sales price in our country. Okay, so you can see 27% is the historical average, and you can see the fluctuation over time. And you can also see what we're dealing with. We have these two perceptions. We have long-term history and we have short-term history. Long-term history, 27% of the average American's income is necessary to for principal and interest on a median sales price home. 27% if you go back to 1972, but if you look from 2000 forward, it's actually 20%, right? So our short-term perception is that's the norm. Today, we're at 32%, right? So that's a big difference, right? 20% to 32% is a significant difference. So we are absolutely on a national level, right? There is a squeeze in affordability. Again, these are things we need to know on a local basis and understand where that lies in our market, right? But we are significantly above the short-term average as well as the long-term average currently. Economy, let's run through some of this stuff quick. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, but GDP, long story short, with GDP, they want to see that's our gross domestic product. They want to see that in the 2 to 3 range. I think 3 is the target range for that. And you can see we're pretty close to that right now. That has a big effect on the economy and inflation. This is GDP broken down quarterly, which again, this is your growth. And we're actually in a pretty healthy place. I'm going to fire through the economic slides really quickly. Here's what you do need to know, what the economic slides tell us compared to the real estate slides. For some of us, it might feel like we are in a recession. The country is not in a recession. The real estate industry is in a recession. But the country is not. The economy is not in a recession. We are dealing with recession-like traits due to lack of inventory. Period. End of story. Now, again, that being said, in the grand scheme of things, go back to that volume slide. Despite the shortage of inventory from a volume standpoint, 2024 was one of the best years in a long time based on volume, right? So our income opportunity is still pretty significant despite the challenges that we have with inventory. Here's what I would ask everybody to take away from that. If you're here and it feels hard right now, you should know that you're surviving the winter. And the winter isn't actually that bad, right? It gets warmer from here. We don't know exactly when, right? The clouds are going to break and the sun is going to come out and the grass is going to pop up through the snow. We don't know. It's just a season. It's what real estate does. And despite it being winter right now, it's actually, in the grand scheme of things, if you look at what allows us to take care of our families, which is the volume of real estate we sell, it's actually a mild winter. Might not always feel that way, but from an income standpoint, it's a mild winter. From a unit standpoint, it's a very cold winter, right? Unemployment target on this is about 4%. You can see we're at about 4%. Again, GDP is on target to where they want to see it. Unemployment is around where they want to see it at that 4% rate. Here you can see the trends. It's just another visualization that shows you the ups and downs. Obviously, in 2019, that's where we saw that spike when the pandemic first hit, and then it immediately came right back down, and we're sitting at about 4% unemployment right now. All those things are healthy and good, right? It's the moral of that story. This I find very interesting. Personal savings rates. Notice the trend, go all the way back to 1959 and look at that trend. We as Americans are consistently saving less and less and less and less and less and less money every year, every generation, right? So 8.3% of total income is your average if you go all the way back to 1959. However, if you split this in half, it's the tale of two stories, right? You go back to here, essentially 1990, everything pre-1990 other than this little dip is way above that, all the way up to 13.5% in 1973, right? And then we get to 1990 and look what happens. Plummets all the way down to 2.3% in 2005. Here's what I find interesting. 2005 was a economic and a real estate boom. And the percent of income that Americans were saving dropped to the lowest point since 1959, right? Then we start to see it creep up. And then you go to the next real estate boom, and look what happens. Pandemic hit in 2019, massive spike in savings. What was that? People panicked and hoarded cash, as they should have. But look how long it lasted before it dropped all the way down, right? We were at 1.5 in 2020, skyrocketed up in 2021, and then dropped all the way back down to 3.8. Which the irony of that is, I look at this and what it tells me is, the better the economy, the less money we save. Isn't that ironic? The better we're doing, the less money we save. Right?
Is that because we're investing it instead of saving it? Or is that just me hopeful?
I would love for that to be true. I don't know that I believe that it's true. And I don't have a statistic to be able to answer whether or not that is accurate or not. I would hope it would be true, and I don't think we would find that that is the case. I think the better we're doing, the more comfortable we are, and the less we focus on having that safety net, especially when we have a lot of value in our homes, right? Because historically, we have a tendency to use our homes like piggy banks, like ATM machines. We refi. Now, by the way, I don't think I have a slide in here, but I have seen it in multiple different places that revolving debt in the United States is skyrocketing. My impression of why we're seeing that skyrocketing of revolving debt is because Americans have more equity than they've ever had before, but because they have interest rates locked in so low, they don't want to refi to get cash out, which is what we used to do, right? We used to jack up our revolving debt, i.e. credit cards, right? And then when it got too much, we'd refi, pay them off. I think what's happening is people don't want to tap into their homes because they have rates so low that we're seeing more people leaning on credit and credit cards than we are equity. There's going to be a tipping point where that does not work anymore. And there is actually a very tiny, but a tiny increase in delinquencies that is showing up, right? It's very much behind the curtain still, yet it is showing up. Inflation, we all know how important that is. I feel like we've been talking about inflation nonstop for years now. You can see it went all the way up to 7%. Right. And then the Fed had a really hard time cooling that off. The reality is they pumped so much cash into the market during the pandemic to avoid pain. Right. There's a massive lesson in everything that happened in the pandemic. And the pandemic was a terrible event. Let's just acknowledge that. An absolutely terrible thing. And in an effort to avoid the pain of that moment, the government flooded the market with capital. And it made everybody feel fat and happy in the middle of a time where nobody should have felt that way. And then all of a sudden, inflation went through the roof. Well, of course it did. Everybody was getting checks and grants and all this stuff, which made everybody feel far more comfortable than they should have felt. So they started spending. And then inflation went through the roof. And then they started making the adjustments they would normally do to interest rates to try to reel that inflation in. But the problem was it wasn't working. No matter how high they raised the rates, we kept buying cars, we kept going on vacations, we kept doing everything we wanted to do. And they could not rein it in, which is why we have this long stretch here before we finally got down to what is healthy inflation, which is where we are right now. Right? 2% inflation is healthy, right? That's where we want to be. Theoretically, they're not directly connected, but they influence each other, or often at least move in a similar direction. The longer we can keep inflation there, the more likely it is to see rates coming down. And again, they're not directly related, but they tend to hang out together, if that makes sense. The other thing I'll tell you that is fascinating to me, I was at an event where they were putting up economic slides, And I noticed a parallel, and I took a snapshot of the two slides. And what I realized was, as rates go up, and so inflation is high, they dial up interest rates in order to try to pull down inflation. They showed two graphs. One was interest rates and one was inflation. And when I looked at them, I realized there's a pattern there. The interest rate actually has to meet inflation before you see inflation come down. They have to meet each other. And I looked at those trends, and at the time, I think rates were in like the 4% range. And I turned to the person next to me and I said, you notice this pattern? The crazy thing is, based on that data, that means rates have to get to almost 8% before we see inflation come down. Like, so history says we're going to see interest rates close to 8%, which at the time, that individual turned and looked at me and said, oh my gosh, could you even imagine? Well, guess what? Fast forward, what did interest rates do? They got to almost 8% before inflation started coming down. They met, right? There is a clear pattern there. And this is what I mean when you start to learn these things, you do start to notice the patterns, and then you have the ability to see what's coming, right? It's a lot like when I talk to people about a profit and loss, right? When you're new to looking at a profit and loss, even though it's addition and subtraction, it can be very confusing and overwhelming. The first step is to have it. Second step is to learn how to read it. And eventually you learn how to write it, meaning I understand it so much, I can make it show up the way I want to show up because I can reverse engineer it. When you start to understand all these dynamics in the industry, it becomes very easy to see what's coming down the road. And then you just ask yourself, okay, based on that, what pivots do I need to be making within my business? Because the reality is we should always be operating in two markets, the market we're in and the market that's coming, right? And those who get really good at doing that, they take advantage of every shift that happens in the market because they saw it coming and they make the pivots, right? Okay, economic risk. Unpredictable policy, trade, immigration, regulation, spending, natural disasters, and international conflicts. Those are our big risks right now. Trade policy is a big issue when it comes to new construction. There's a lot of conversation around tariffs right now. Tariffs tend to make materials cost more money when they come from outside of the country. When it comes to construction, most of our materials come from outside the country. Canada provides a massive amount. I don't know the exact number. I believe it's 60 some odd % of the lumber for new construction, I believe, comes from Canada. So some challenges we do face with new construction. Part of why we are not building at the rate that we need to build is, despite the shortage in inventory, it is very difficult for builders to make money right now. That is being caused by two things. One is the cost of material, and two is lack of labor. This is not a political statement, but tariffs are highly likely to cause those materials to become more expensive, if nothing else, definitely more volatile, which makes it harder to plan a project. And we are arguably pushing out a lot of the labor that is very necessary in the construction industry. So those are two things that could become very challenging for us. Okay, a couple other specific size per agent. I think this is a really important one. It's easy to say, okay, we have this many units, this much volume, this much whatever. Think of it like the grocery store, right? There's X number of loaves of bread on the shelf. Well, how many people are there shopping, right? If there's 5 loaves in one person, that person's going to be able to carb up pretty good. If there's 5 loaves, but there's 30 people there, well, guess what? We're all splitting loaves, taking a couple slices. So this shows you the trend based on how many units are available and what the agent population actually is. And right now they're predicting 5.8 units per agent. We finished last year at 5.4. Historical average going back to 1977 is 9.5. Okay. And you can see some stats here. 2000 to 2007, NAR added 591,000 agents. Okay. 08 to 2012. That was the Great Recession. We lost 338,000 agents. 2013 to 2024, NAR actually added 456,000 agents, right? So we have not seen the agent population shrink. despite the fact that we have less homes to sell, which is why you're seeing that available units per agent going down. Does that make sense? Volume per agent, the story changes again, right? If you go volume per agent, so if we go back, we're not going to go back. Can I do it here? I can do it here. There we go. Oh, my mouse won't let me do this. Hold up. There we go. So 5.4 units per agent is the lowest that we have seen all the way back to 1977. But it's the same as the slides that we started out with. You jump over to volume, which is what we actually get compensated off, and it's a very different story, right? 2023, we were at 2.69. Other than, so let's see, we have 4 years that were better than that, going all the way back to 2000. 2022 was higher, 2021 was higher, 04 and 05, which was the last 2 years right before we saw the decline of the Great Recession. We had more volume, right? So last year was actually our 5th best year in available volume per agent. Again, I feel like it's really important to know these things because a lot of times we talk about how things feel, and how they feel aren't always what they actually are, right? Prediction for 2024, we finished at 2.9, right? So again, volume-wise, pretty solid. Very quick update, TCPA, you may or may not have been aware of this. There was I guess a law, you would call it, that was passed. It was the one-to-one contact that basically said in order to be TCA compliant, a consumer had to give you direct permission on a one-on-one basis. It could not be per company, i.e., if they go to a KW website and agree to the terms, that does not apply to you. If you own multiple companies and you have those multiple companies included in those terms, that does not count. It was you need literal one-to-one permission in order to contact a consumer. That may or may not sound like a big deal to you. It actually is a very big deal because it's very hard to manage. That was supposed to go into effect a couple of months ago. It was delayed and has currently been delayed again. So that is not going into effect. So just a little nugget to be aware of. At least it's not, I believe it's been delayed for a year now, if I'm not mistaken. So it doesn't mean it won't happen, but currently that can has been kicked. Listings with price drops. So this is interesting. This is month by month, 2023 to January of 2025. Nationally, very clear pattern. Once again, remember what happens elsewhere in the country tends to show up here, just slightly smaller, right? So if you look at this, there is a very, very clear trend that we are seeing more and more price reductions. Right. So it's reasonable to believe that we are going to eventually see that. Again, I don't know what the time span is. My experience has been we usually see it 18 to 24 months later than the markets like Florida, Arizona, Texas, and California. Our inventory issue is a little bit unique compared to most of the country. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. The other thing that I found interesting, does anybody see an interesting trend other than we're moving towards more and more price reductions? Does anybody notice anything on this graph? Come on, it's there. It's there. Have you ever had somebody say, I want to list my house, but I'm not going to list my house in December. It's a terrible time. Nobody's buying houses in December. Look at these trends. 2 years in a row. I saw this and I thought it would be interesting to look at this for a longer period of time. You notice the dip? December has less price reductions than any other month. In both years, you saw a dip in price reductions in December, which would lead you to believe December is actually a really good time to sell as far as getting the most amount of money you can possibly get. So 2023, you saw a dip from 28%, had price reductions down to 2022 or down to 22, and then it immediately started going up again. The same thing happened this year in 2024. It was a rise, dropped for December, and bounced right back up for January. It's an interesting trend, right? Again, look at that for a longer period of time. Does that show up consistently? That's a really great nugget to be able to share with somebody who thinks kicking the can until January is a good idea. Say, actually, statistically, homes that sell in December or homes in December take less price reductions than now. It could also be that maybe agents and sellers just choose not to do a price reduction during that holiday season. Maybe they think they won't get their bang for the buck by doing that. But in either case, there's a pattern, right? Not necessarily a trend because we have 2 years. Go back and look at that. Is that something that consistently shows up? It's interesting. New listings. So number of new listings. Again, January, you saw an uptick to 406. If you go back to January of 2023, it was 301. So we're actually seeing more homes nationally coming on the market. Again, all things that we are likely to see. I mentioned distressed homes briefly. So if you look at this, again, go back to the banking crash for those of us who were in the market back then. Look at this. So the blue is foreclosure and the orange or yellow, whatever color that is short sales. So back in 08, 27% of the market was foreclosures and 13% was short sales. By the way, going back to recognizing patterns and knowing how to respond to things before the events actually happen, because you identified that the events are going to happen, do you think the people who saw the banking crash coming that pivoted to short sales and foreclosures did okay in that market? They actually did just fine in that market. They did really fine in that market, right? But look at the size, like massive chunk of the market was distressed. And then, 2012 to 13 is when we started to see that decline. And we sat about 1% or less all the way up until 2023. We saw an uptick to 2%. 2024, it held at 2%, right? So we are seeing a little bit of an uptick here. What I have seen other places, so this is actual distressed sales. What I have seen is that there is an uptick right now. So this is what I kind of call the behind the curtain. There is an uptick in 90-day lates on mortgages right now, right? And that's kind of your first domino. That's before we see them show up on the market as distressed. However, I have not spoken to anybody who is making an argument that there's going to be a massive distressed market, because what's different today is people have equity in their home. So they have options that don't involve them losing their home or having to do a short sale. So it doesn't mean they won't exist, but it's likely we're not going to see a massive spike like we saw in the Great Recession, because the difference in the Great Recession is their property values plummeted and they ended up upside down on their homes. So then they couldn't afford the mortgage and they couldn't sell the house without it being a foreclosure or a short sale. We have more equity than we've ever had in history in our home, so that is unlikely to happen. But there is an uptick in distressed sales, and there is an uptick in 90-day lates behind the curtain. Underwater homes almost don't exist. Again, go back to the Great Recession. This is Q3 2010. Almost 25% of homes were upside down. All right, and it stayed that way essentially all the way to 2012, and then we finally started to see that declining. We're all the way down at 1.8%. So it's less than 2% of the homes out there are actually upside down on value and mortgage. And candidly, I'm surprised the number's even that high, right? With the amount of appreciation and equity that we've had. But the number is very, very low, which again lends itself to the fact that there isn't going to be a massive distressed market boom that is going to happen like the Great Recession. This is just a graphic that shows credit conditions. So are they tightening or are they loosening? You can see when they loosened, all of this is when everything was tightening up. That was going into the banking crash. And then things started to loosen up right around 2020. Things started to tighten up again. right? Just shows you how restrictive they are in the lending world. New home starts. This one is really, really important. This actually tells the story of why we are where we are. If you go back to 2005, 2006, you can see we're building 1.7 and 1.4 new construction. And you see, this is actually, which was really interesting. I think it was Gary at the tail end of the crash. So it was somewhere around here at Family Reunion. I remember him going through these slides, and the comment he made was, a lot of people think the banking crash caused the real estate crash. But what really caused the real estate crash was builders not building. Had builders continued to build at the same pace that they had prior to the banking crash, the real estate market would not have crashed. Now, when you think about that, you're like, oh, wow, that actually makes complete sense. Because when the banking crash happened, people ended up upside down in their house, which did what? It caused real estate transactions. It just caused a different type. It caused foreclosures and it caused short sales. So that created transactions. What actually caused that drop to 4 million, 4.1 million was the fact that builders stopped building. That's actually what caused the housing recession, right? And you can see how far it dropped. Went from all the way down to 445. And you see the slow uptick. But you can see, think about the gap in housing that gets created over this time frame. If this
I
is,
gotta push back a little bit here, Matt.
what's that?
I want to push back a little bit and play devil's advocate.
Sure, I love
Because even if builders were building more during 08, 09, 010, lenders weren't giving money to anybody that wasn't rich. I mean,
that. It was very restrictive, yes.
so how did the builders cause the crash?
So cause probably isn't the right way to say it.
Okay.
The economic situation is probably, it's probably more fair to say that that was the cause. The point that I'm making is that if builders maintained the level of building that was historically normal, not even at this level, but at the 1,000 unit level.
You mean a million?
Exactly. I'm sorry, million. This gap would have been filled.
Okay.
Right. So the only point I'm making is we think about the Great Recession and how it impacted real estate.
Correct.
The reality is the impact on real estate was it caused more transactions. However,
that makes total sense. Things opened up in 012. That's when the floodgates started to open and banks were lending again. So if we went back up to that million mark, which we need to be just to keep up with population, things would be very different now.
Very different.
But
yes,
so many small builders went under.
Correct. And by the way, have never come back.
Right.
And that's why we saw this massive gap that lies under that green line. That's just a compounding effect every year of having less and less bread on the shelves, less and less bread on the shelves, less and less bread on the shelves.
And I would go further to say that those smaller builders were the ones building the smaller homes.
Correct. Yes. That is another challenge today is economically, it's hard to build a small home and actually make money. Right.
And anybody that's going to risk $1 million to buy something, to knock it down, to hold it for a year and a half, to rebuild, they're not going to put up a 1,500 square foot cape.
Correct.
They're going to do the 5,000 square foot McMansion for the family of 3.
You got it. And this is the conundrum that we're in now, right? So you take that giant gap of time where we were underdeveloping. Then all of a sudden you have interest rates drop into the 4s, the 3s, and even the sub 3s, which shoots demand through the roof. And all of a sudden you look up and we're exactly where we are today, where we have historically low inventory. It's a combination of inflated demand due to depressed rates and that long-term effect of builders not building at the level that they historically have.
And not building what's needed.
Correct.
The
Yep.
only thing we built are McMansions, 2 townhouses, or a corporation put up 300 apartments.
I was going to say an apartment
And that's
buildings.
due to zoning.
Yep. It's McMansions and apartment buildings are what is being built right now. 100%.
Right.
So new home sales, again, you can see back to 05, the peak. You can see the same dip. You can see there was the little bit of a comeback in that 2020, 2021, which is full-blown pandemic. And then you see it dropping down again into this range here. So we still have a lot of ground to make up when it comes to new constructions. We talked about the challenges with new construction. It's regulatory, which is a big problem in New England. We have regulated out a lot of new construction. We like our open space. We like our cozy little towns. It is very hard to build in Connecticut or in New England. Costs have gone up, volatility with materials, persistent labor shortages, and profitability are all challenges that the building industry is facing. Again, I'm by no stretch the smartest guy in the room. Yet, if the government wants to do something to influence this, the thing they need to do is to work with builders to find ways to allow them to build at scale and at profitability, right? Connecticut's a really good example. We've poured tons of funding into supporting buyers buying houses, which is just adding to the problem. We already have a demand issue, and they're directing funds towards creating more demand when we don't have the supply to feed the demand before they infuse capital into making the demand even bigger. That doesn't make sense. We have to solve the supply problem, not the demand problem, right? Student debt, this is shocking, right? If you got young kids, plumbers make real good money. Paydays on Friday and poop rolls downhill, right? College debt, massive. You go back to 05, right? This is student loans and this is overall consumer debt. You can see a massive spike in both, right? This goes back to what I was saying about, I think a lot of consumers are tapping into credit cards instead of equity because they have so much equity. But consumer debt is going through the roof right now, right? So something for us all to be aware of and to be aware of in our own behaviors, right? Our own budgeting. Last piece is insurance. Insurance is a big problem. End of the day, cost is going up and natural disasters are becoming more and more commonplace. In specific areas, the obvious ones being Florida and California are being massively impacted, and homeowners and values are being impacted, and the market is being impacted by the insurance industry. There are high rates of non-renewals happening and large insurers that are completely pulling out of both of those states, which is causing a real problem in those states. This actually shows just sort of a heat map of the United States. And I actually thought it was interesting. I was surprised to see that a good chunk of New England, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island is in that dark red, right? Which is on the higher end of non-renewals for insurance. I fully expected to see that in hurricane territory, fire territory.
Yeah, do you have any information on why Massachusetts is so red?
I don't. Honestly,
I was surprised to see that too.
Coastal storms.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
would do it.
I mean, I guess theoretically, and I don't even want to say this out loud, but like, I mean, we haven't had massive damaging storms in New England at the level that, you know, we see from the Florida all the way up to the Carolinas. I was surprised when I saw Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island dark like that. I was a little bit surprised. I do have to assume it probably has something to do with the coastal area, but we certainly do not get hit with the amount of natural disasters in New England as they do in a lot of those other places. And a lot of these places are heavily populated. I will also share, there was an individual, and I do not remember who it was. It was a little while back who said to me, the next economic crash will be caused by the insurance industry. And it will be worse than the banking crash. That was probably a decade ago that individual said that to me. And he explained why, and it had to do with global warming, natural disasters, and the rising sea levels. And that we were going to eventually start seeing natural disasters at a level that insurance companies cannot keep up with. Ironically, that was about a decade ago. Somebody said that to me, and here we are. It's actually part of the conversation when we talk about real estate now. Just fascinating.